Aloha, como mai. Welcome aboard. Welcome to the Just Cruisin' podcast. This podcast was recorded on Thursday, September 3rd, 2020. I'm Larry Jackson, owner of Cruise Holidays of Viera. I'll be your cruise director for this week's podcast. That's all about the wonderful world of travel and cruising. And so glad you could be with us today. Thanks for joining me. The title of this week's edition of the Just Cruisin' podcast is The Long Winding Road. And we're going to take a little page out of the Beatles' Let It Be album, and we're going to talk about the long winding road to restarting cruising. But before we get started, I want to remind you that these podcasts are brought to you by Cruise Holidays of Viera. We are a boutique travel planning advisory agency, and the best way to find out information about us and to contact us is to go to our website, Just Cruisin' Viera, V-I-E-R-A, Just Cruisin' with no G, Viera.com. Love for you to go to our website, look around. We got a lot of great information for you there. We also have previous podcasts there for you if you'd like to hear some of the other ones that we've recorded in the past weeks. Well, last week we recounted the history of the shutdown of the cruise industry during the pandemic. We talked about how we were on a cruise on March 13th when all of this began, and what happened in the ensuing weeks to basically shut down the entire travel industry. And just in case you missed that podcast, if you ever want to get some of our previous podcasts or listen to future podcasts, please just Google Just Cruisin' with Larry, and it'll bring up all the different podcast sites available for you. I remind you to subscribe to our podcast so that you'll automatically be notified when we have a future one coming out. Well, here we are. We're in the middle of our pandemic, and as we said, we shut down cruising basically on March 13th of 2020. And we still have not, for the most part, haven't started sailing again. We right now are under a no-sail order by the CDC, which currently extends through September 30th of 2020. In addition, the Cruise Lines International Association, known as CLIA, of which we're a member, has declared a temporary or a suspension of all cruises basically through November 1st. Now, there are a few other cruise lines that have extended their no-sail or their suspension of cruising for a further period, such as Cunard is basically all the way out to around March of 2021. Princess has pretty much suspended all of their cruises through December. And so right now, November 1st is our date. Honestly, I'm not very optimistic about that date, as I'll tell you a little later on during this podcast. We are basically awaiting the CDC to give us the guidelines and then tell us that we can start sailing again. Now, one of the things that has delayed that is in July, when they gave us this last no-sail order, they also put out a notice in the Federal Registry asking for public comment on resuming sailing. And why they did this is beyond nobody has any earthly idea why they did this. Why would you ask the public to tell you comments about something that's going to be so basically technical and scientific as how do we make cruise ships safe when we, in the middle of this pandemic, when we come back? So that's where we are right now. And let's look at some of the issues as we look forward going back to cruising again. We have had some attempts at being able to start back up in cruising. Most notably, Uncruise, which is probably a cruise line you've never heard of. They have very small ships in Hawaii and Alaska. Had attempted a cruise in July with only 60 passengers aboard it. I'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. The Paul Gauguin out in Tahiti attempted a cruise also. They are a 300-passenger ship. I think they only had about 120 people on board. And we also had Hurtigruten and Sea Dream attempt cruises out of Norway. And all of this has happened during the month of July. In the case of Hurtigruten, they had, I think, about 12 people that tested positive. And so they cut their cruise short, came back, put everybody into quarantine, and canceled all the cruises for the rest of the year, basically. Sea Dream had a similar situation where they had one person test positive, so they came back to port, canceled all their cruises. And Paul Gauguin had a similar situation. On cruise, I bring this story up to you because this kind of shows us what we're up against as far as resuming cruising. When they had 60 passengers on board, I think it's a 160 passenger ship, and they sailed out of Juneau. Now, when before you could go on the cruise, before you could book it, you had to have a COVID-19 negative test. I think it was valid previous 5 days, and before you arrived in Juneau to get on board the ship. In Juneau, the Alaskan authorities had imposed a requirement that anybody landing in the state of Alaska would have to have a COVID-19 test at the airport. Everybody tested negative before they got there, got on the ship. 2 days later, Juneau, the Alaskan authorities informed the ship that one of the passengers had tested positive at their airport test, not the previous test. Nobody had any symptoms. There was no problem as far as that was concerned. Excuse me. So, ship returns back to Anchorage. Steward probably, they put everybody in a hotel and quarantined them, and then they cancel all their Alaska cruises. Well, as it turns out, the passengers the positive testing, the whole season, what little bit of the Alaska season was left was gone. So those were our previous attempts in the months of July and August. Now, just a couple weeks ago, on August 16th, MSC Cruises started a cruise, and everybody has been really watching this cruise because it's we're trying to see if what MSC did is what we need to do, as they say, crack the code to be able to resume going back to cruising. So the 4,842 passenger MSC Grandiosa sailed out of Genoa. They sailed with they were going to ports in Italy and Malta. Of the 4,800 passenger capacity, they really never released the number of passengers they had on board, but it was roughly 50%, roughly 60%, it was roughly 3,000 passengers. All of the passengers had to be from what they call the Shingen countries, and those are basically EU countries. There's 26 of them that signed an agreement many years ago. It's EU countries excluding UK and Ireland. And these 26 countries in Europe a few years ago had decided they were going to make this covenant that it's called Schengen, Schengen. I'd never heard of it. These are Schengen countries, and they don't have to have passports or visas to go back and forth among the countries. And it's pretty much all the countries in Europe that you've ever heard of. So only the passengers from those countries can be on board the MSC Grandiosa when she sailed on August 16th. All right, some few other requirements for this ship was for the sailing that all the passengers had to have had a test that was negative for COVID-19 in the moments before boarding. Now, what MSC did was they had I don't know how they did this, but they have a rapid test that they were able to test everybody when they got to the terminal, and they had to be negative before they got on board the ship. That's one requirement. Now, here's the first problem they had. Someone showed up at the ship, and when they did that test, they were tested positive. All right, they were denied boarding. That's not the only problem. The folks that they were with on a van in from the airport who tested negative, they were not allowed to board. So I'm just bringing this up because you can see these are some of the problems we're going to have when we start sailing again here in the United States. As far as onboard experiences, all the bars were open, all the restaurants were open. You did have to wear a mask in public areas. You didn't have to wear it in the restaurants when you're eating and in your cabin. But the entertainment had social distancing, all the things that you'd expect on board as far as the onboard experience. That really didn't have a large impact on the passengers as far as that was concerned, or at least all the reviews I've read. The one big impact I think that this cruise had was the shore excursions. You were not allowed to take any independent shore excursions. You were not allowed to get off the boat unless you were aboard on an MSC designated tour. And the tours took place in Naples and Palermo and places like that. All of the guides on the tour were tested negative. The buses were sanitized. They used social distancing on the buses, every other seat and things like that. Another problem arose. Family went to Naples on one of the shore excursions and then decided they were going to tour Naples on their own. They left the tour. When they got back to the ship, their luggage was waiting for them on the dock, and they were denied reboarding, and they had to fly home, I guess, to Genoa. So that just gives you an indication. The sailing went very well. We had no outbreaks. We had no other positive tests. And by the way, all the people that tested positive were asymptomatic. So, just bring it. Is this what cruising is going to look like when we start back up? It's really hard to say, but at least it's a start. So we are all looking for any little glimmer of hope at this point to get things started. Basically, we have three impediments towards resumption of cruising, and those three impediments. The first one, hurdles, obstacles, whatever you want to call it. The first one and the foremost one is the CDC. Number two is going to be the ports of call that we want to go to, and number three is going to be you, the consumer, and your attitude towards cruising when it restarts and with the measures that we're taking. All right, the CDC. I really don't know who ticked the folks off at CDC about cruising, but there's somebody there who really doesn't like it. They are pretty much doing anything they can to prevent cruising from starting again. And a case in point is this comment period that they suddenly decided out of nowhere that they were going to have comments from the public. Now, these comments are due by September 21st. As I said, our no sail order expires on September 30th, so obviously they can't. I think they've gotten something like 6,000 or 7,000 comments already. They're not going to be able to digest that, and I don't know why some guy sitting in Paducah, Kentucky is going to be an expert on what the cruise line should do when they restart cruising as far as sanitation and all of the things. But that delayed the whole process. And I thought I'd read you some of the questions that they asked so you can see the nature of what the comments that they were asking for. Here are just some of the ones that I pulled out. How should this is now the CDC is telling you these questions, and they're asking you, the public. And by the way, you have plenty of time to do this if you'd like to do it. All you got to do is Google CDC Comments section cruises, and you can make your own comments if you'd like. All right, here's a question. How should cruise ship operators bolster their internal public health programs with public health experts and invest in a robust public health infrastructure to ensure compliance with measures to detect, prevent, and control the spread of COVID-19? Here's another question. Because reports of illness may lead to restrictions on crew activities, how should cruise ship operators encourage crew members to report mild symptoms of COVID-like illness to medical personnel? So someone catches I'm surmising here, but someone catches a cold. They're down in the crew quarters at lunch, and three other people catch that guy's cold. And all of a sudden, okay, this may be COVID, so we better quarantine these people. Here goes the crew. I don't have any crew anymore. And what do you know about this type of situation that you could help the CDC plan for the reopening? Because obviously they don't know what to do, so they're asking you to help them. Here's another question. What should be the medical capacity to manage an outbreak of severe case of COVID-19 on board the ship? What arrangements should cruise ship operators have with private companies to transport and obtain medical care shoreside for passengers and crew with severe COVID-19? You think you're going to be able to go to a port of call and say, hey, if we have outbreak of COVID-19, do you mind if we bring 15, 20 passengers out to your hotel, hospital, wherever, even though you've had no cases in your town for the last 6 months or whatever, you wouldn't mind if we just bring these people to your hospital to get treatment, would you? So you can tell by the nature of the questions their attitude towards whether we're going to be able to restart cruising or not. Here's another one. What prearrangements should be made to ensure that all U.S. seaport communities will accept a returning ship after a COVID-19 outbreak is identified? Now, their presumption is you're going to have outbreaks of COVID-19. I mean, they seem to be treating this like the Norovirus, where you're going to have these outbreaks, and but the corona is just totally different from Norovirus and those types of things. Here's another one. What measures should cruise ship operators be required to take to reduce the burden on U.S. government resources if foreign seaports deny cruise ships the ability to come into port during a voyage? In other words, are you going to require the U.S. Navy to send the USS Comfort out to Malta to pick up the passengers that won't be able to be disembarked be in Malta? So this is just so absurd to me. Well, here's some of the comments. I like the here's some of the comments that you all made back to the CDC in regards to whether ships should resume cruising. All right, here's one, and this is a quote now. I say, have us sign waivers prior to boarding that says we will not hold the cruise line or CDC responsible for cruising, that we understand risk, limit capacity on ships, make masks mandatory of getting off the cruise but not on the cruise, have a lot of sanitizer stations. It says acceptable, it means available. This has not been edited, this is the straight comment. Close off bathrooms, have us use our own room bathrooms. That's going to cut down on the alcohol consumption at the bars, but it's another person wrote, it's time to sail. We have waited long enough. Who knows when the virus will go away? If we can sail during flu season, we can sail during this, ! 7 of them, okay? Here's another one. I like this. Questions on the survey include such queries as what mental health services should cruise ship operators provide to crew and passengers during quarantine or isolation? What precautions should the cruise industry take to safely disembark passengers and crew without transmitting COVID-19 into local seaport communities? Okay, this last one. What innovations should cruise ship operators develop to reduce transmission of COVID-19 on board ships, and how would these innovations be effective? One person responded angrily to the last one. It is totally ridiculous to ask that question. This will be transmitted anywhere in the world, not just on ships. They should indeed have the right to quarantine ill passengers, crew. Make sure hands are washed, temperatures taken frequently for now. Masks are worthless. So anyway, you can see that the public comments don't look like they're being particularly helpful. Now, prior to the CDC coming out with this public comment period, Royal Caribbean started a joint venture with Norwegian Cruise Lines. Now, this is pretty unheard of. This is kind of a revolutionary thing. And what they did was the CDC had asked the cruise lines to come in with a comprehensive plan to restart cruising. And Royal Caribbean and Norwegian Cruise Line took this very seriously, and they assembled a blue ribbon panel of health experts that they called the Healthy Sail Panel. And what they were tasked with doing is guiding Royal Caribbean with new recommendations on how to start cruising again. And then they were going to make this report to the CDC. They went out and spent a lot of money hiring very, very prominent qualified people. Here's some of the people. The head of the panel is Governor Mike Leavitt, who's the former secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. And another person on the panel is Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. 9 other experts are on the panel with expertise in public health, biosecurity, hospitality, and maritime operations. On top of that, Royal Caribbean has hired a new public health and chief medical officer whose name is Dr. Calvin Johnson. So Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, now Carnival also created their own panel separate from Norwegian Cruise Lines. The cruise lines all agreed that whatever their recommendations were, they would share them with all of the other cruise lines, so everybody would have the same. Nobody's going to keep this, proprietary. Hey, our panel came up with. We're not going to tell you what we're doing. All of the cruise industry is going to do the same thing. Don't you think this would have been much more beneficial to the CDC than this public comment period through September 21st? The panel's tasking was set so that they would respond to the CDC by the end of August, which would greatly have accelerated our return to cruising. But because of this September 21st deadline on the comments, it pushed everything back. So they get the comments. Let's say, it has been almost it's 5 months now since we suspended sailing, and the CDC has come out with zilch guidelines for cruises to restart. They did come out with some guidelines for getting the crews home when they were on board the ship, but that's it. For 5 months, they've done nothing, and now they get these comments. They're going to get the information from Royal Caribbean's panel. How long is it going to take them to digest that and then put out new recommendations for us to restart cruising? The other question is, what are these recommendations going to look like? Are they doable? Are they going to be so onerous that the public is going to say, to heck with this, I'm not going to go cruising. This is ridiculous. So these are the problems. I think one of the problems we've had with the CDC, and this all started back when the first pandemic all started and broke out, is this mythology about how American cruise lines don't pay taxes, and therefore the U.S. government shouldn't respond to them, and who cares if they ever sail again? And this is totally false. The cruise lines pay taxes all over the United States. They pay port taxes. They pay taxes all over the world to support communities. Matter of fact, I have a story here where Port Canaveral, my home port, has just had their bond rating downgraded because they can't collect the revenues that they're dependent upon to service their debt from the revenues that they get from cruise operations because of this shutdown. CDC doesn't look at things. How about all of the different jobs that have been lost, all the people that are unemployed because of cruising, and not just here in the United States, but these Caribbean countries depend almost exclusively on these cruise lines coming in to provide outside income. These people have been totally destroyed by this, while the CDC sits around as a political organization deciding when and how we're going to restart the cruising. I think it's all political. A lot of people have conjectured that they're not going to do anything until after the elections because they don't want to impact the elections. And so that's it. That's my soapbox on the CDC. I think this is absolutely, totally unfair. I really want to know who died and made the CDC king of cruising. Okay, enough of that. Number 2 problem I talked about is, what about the ports of call? And I'll give you a really good example, and that's the U.S. Virgin Islands, USVI. Back in March, when the whole thing broke out on the pandemic, their governor, the governor of the territory, Governor Albert Bryan, shut down the place. They totally shut it down. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't leave the house. Just like all the hysteria we had in this country. And they had a 75-day run. They had a few outbreaks that were isolated, which they managed to contain. But as this article says, unfortunately, case numbers continue to creep up, some of which were attributed to community spread by residents returning from other destinations. Okay, the island shut down, but people are coming home. Probably crew members and things like that, or people are returning home because they lost their jobs. They by mid-August, they said, oops, this is not, we got it, it's breaking out again. So they shut the island down again. Is this going to happen to us when we start cruising? Do we go into a port of call? We leave a week later, they have 30 cases where they had none, or they have 50 cases where they had 10. That's going to shut that down, and then we don't have any place to go. Okay, so Hawaii is a great example. They have done the same thing. Another island that's shut down. Things went really well for a while, but the cases are back up again, and now they're shut down. And so it just extends it out, keeps extending it out. As we extend out these shutdowns, that further delays our ports of call that we have available. What about cruises to nowhere? Well, we have a problem with that because the Johnson Act, which we've talked about before, which, by the way, I'll go back to that one more time. Someone needs to ask for a waiver to the Johnson Act. This is the act that prevents an internationally flagged carrier from going to two different international ports, or a whole bunch of international ports without, going to two domestic U.S. ports without having gone to one international port somewhere along the way. For example, if we didn't have the Jones Act, why did I call it the Jones? I apologize. I pulled a Biden there. The Jones Act, which, for instance, we could leave, if we didn't have the Jones Act, we could leave Port Canaveral. We could cruise up to Savannah, over to Charleston, go up to Norfolk, Virginia, maybe up to Boston and New York City. Wouldn't that be cool? Cruising in New York City, spend the night, go to a Broadway show, cruise back down to Port Canaveral. We can't do that because somewhere along the line we'd have to go to the Bahamas. And so if we think it's safe in the United States to cruise just in the United States, if we got rid of the Jones Act, we could take our large ships and we could do that. That would be a great way to help restart cruising. Someone needs to ask Congress for a waiver to that. This happened before. It happened in 2016 during one of the hurricanes when Puerto Rico needed that to be able to resupply their country. So that's another thing that we could be doing, but it's not happening, and I have to blame a lot of what's going on with this whole situation on CLIA, the Cruise Lines International Association. And they have not done a very good job of lobbying. They have not done a good job of portraying the cruise lines with the public. We keep hearing this floating petri dish going around, and that's going to really impact things, which brings me to my third point of the impediments to restarting cruising, and that's going to be the attitude you have towards cruising. One of the things I do want to warn you about, and we heard a lot of speculation about this right after the shutdown, is, boy, when they get restarted, we're going to have bargains galore. The pricing is going to be right through the floor, and we're going to be able to take really cheap cruises, and we're going to be really looking forward to that. Now, I don't care if I have to wear a mask, but if it's cruise cheap enough, I'm really going to, this is going to be fantastic. Well, I don't think that's going to happen this time around. People are pointing to the cruise industry right after 9/11 when that happened, and I don't think that's going to happen this time around for a couple of reasons. One is we're going to be restarting in a phased operation, probably with the cruise line. So here's my thought, and this is a guess on my part, nothing official, and you know what, you can hold me to this later on and say, hey, Larry, you're totally wrong about this. But what we look forward to is probably in January, maybe late December, but I don't anticipate it. In January, we start with maybe, in the case of, let's say, Port Canaveral, where we normally have on a weekly basis, we have 2, 4, 6, 8 ships going out, maybe from 4 different cruise lines. Maybe we'll have one ship from each cruise line going out for a 3 or 4 day cruise. Those cruise ships will probably be operating at a 50% capacity. That greatly reduces the amount of cabins that are going to be available for sailing. And that's the supply. And if people want to go cruising, then the demand's going to be high, and that's going to keep the pricing from coming down. The cruise lines have already indicated that they're not anticipating doing aggressive discounting when they come back. And an article I found this week, it says why you shouldn't expect bargain basement cruise deals anytime soon. And it says, people anticipated beginning, they thought they would be rolling out monster deals because that's been the conventional wisdom. According to one cruise line or cruise industry insider, privately travel agency leaders are being told by cruise executives that cruise lines have no intention of dumping prices. Cruise pricing always will be driven by supply and demand. Cruise demand is down right now, but it's probably going to come back. Maybe we get a vaccine. That's going to tremendously, and by the way, I'm not counting on that when I'm talking about this whole thing about restarting cruises. You notice I haven't mentioned the vaccine at all because it's such a long shot, I think, as to whether we'll get it in time to really get everybody, and will people take it? That's the other thing. And how will you prove you had it? All of these things are the unknowns with the vaccine. The return to sailing, Frank Del Rio, who is the president of Norwegian Cruise Line, said initially resume operations in the fall, and that's probably not going to happen, with a single vessel from 3 of Norwegian Cruise Line ships and 1 from Oceania and 1 from Regent. Cruise line giant Carnival Corp also appears to be mapping out a strategy to add back ships in a measured pace. Don't forget, another one of our impediments to returning to cruising is we've got to get the ships operating again, and we got to get the crews back from 157 different countries back on board, tested negatively for the corona. I don't mean to be so negative about my thoughts about returning to cruising. I think we can do it. I think we could be further along in the process if we didn't have this blockade of the CDC standing in our way. If they would just leave the cruise industry to itself, look what we have accomplished over the years with Norovirus. It happens maybe 2 or 3 times a year. It's very well contained on the ship. We know how to quarantine on ships. What happened with the Diamond Princess was a total disaster, but that shouldn't have happened. That was totally mismanaged by both the Japanese authorities and the cruise line. Princess did us a big disservice with that deal. We know how to take care of outbreaks of viruses aboard ships. We are not floating petri dishes. We know what to do. And if you'll just stand back, leave the industry alone and let them do their thing, because they have a very vested interest in making it safe. They want people on board their ships, okay? So I'm optimistic we will be back. Again, I believe it'll be in January, maybe full operation, maybe operations into Europe in June. I'm anticipating going to Alaska next July, and I'll be telling you in the next few weeks about a tour that we put together in Alaska. We are looking at doing some cruising in April to Hawaii. We're also looking at a cruise that goes out of Florida and returns to Florida next April. So we're making plans that the cruising is going to get back to normal in 2021. I don't know if it's going to be the first part or the second part or the last part, but we are optimistic. We will cruise again. We will be back. So please don't let this be a downer for you. I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I remind you about our website at Cruise Holidays of Viera, and it's justcruisinviera.com, just cruising with no G, and then Viera, Viera. We'd love to have you go to our website. We anticipate having another podcast out and available for you by next week, Friday. Maybe it'll be Monday, but if you'll go to one of the websites and subscribe, then you'll get notified when the next one comes out. But we do appreciate your time, and we appreciate you listening to us. And until we see you again, keep on cruising.